Helensburgh, Scotland. It was a cold morning on 30th of January 1985. There was no rain, and Kaisa could just about make out the faint outline of the sun in the distance, low above the Gairloch. The sight of the opaque light behind a thin layer of cloud made Kaisa feel oddly optimistic. She held on tightly to the cup of coffee she'd brewed and inhaled the familiar, comforting smell. She had decided she would drive them to the community centre on the Churchill estate, on the other side of Helensburgh, where the court-martial was to be held. It was only 8:15, and Peter was already wearing his full uniform. With sword, he looked very smart. "Do you want something else before we go? More tea or water?" Kaisa asked. She saw Peter straight back through the open kitchen door. He was standing in front of the mirror in the hall, adjusting his cap. Without turning to look at her or speaking, he shook his head. Peter hadn't wanted her to come to the court, but his lawyer Lawrence had told them Kaisa needed to be there to show the court that they were a happy couple. Kaisa had recoiled from that phrase. She didn't know what happiness was anymore. That morning she dressed in the black trouser suit that she kept for job interviews, with an off-white roll-neck jumper inside the jacket for warmth. Phoebe, her friend on the married patch, and the only Navy wife who still talked to her, had said it was bitterly cold at the community centre, and that they might have to wait around outside for hours before the proceedings started. Kaisa didn't ask how her friend was so knowledgeable. She wondered if the waiting around was part of the punishment, but there'd been very little information about the day, just the one letter summoning Peter to the court-martial at 10 a.m. "You are not needed as a witness because you're my wife. You just need to be present," Peter had told her. His eyes were dark, and as usual, when he spoke with Kaisa these days, they displayed no emotion whatsoever. "I'm going to drive," Kaisa said to Peter's back. She could see his image in the mirror, but couldn't see his eyes under the black peak of his Navy officer's cap. She thought how handsome he still was, even though he'd lost so much weight. The past few weeks, during the awful state of limbo before the court-martial, Kaisa had often coaxed Peter to eat. He'd lost his appetite for food and life, it seemed. She couldn't pinpoint the time when he had changed. At first, when the consequences of all her terrible actions had played out, they'd been able to comfort each other. They were like two survivors, thrown together in a sinking ship, bailing out water, fighting together to remain afloat. But slowly, Peter had drifted away from her, into his own shell, into his own world. He'd grown quieter and wanted to be with her less. Now when Kaisa tried to touch him, he flinched. Kaisa knew it was the impending court-martial that was playing on Peter's mind, so she let him be. She understood how much his career in the Navy meant to him, and hoped that when the proceedings were over they would find a way to love each other again. Outside, braving the strong winds whipping up the hill where the grey pebble-dashed houses of the married quarter stood, Peter looked thin and gaunt. When he removed first his sword and then his cap and placed them carefully on the back seat of the car, Kaisa saw the dark circles around his eyes. Kaisa parked on the sloping car park and pulled up the handbrake hard. Peter winced. He just couldn't get used to her driving. Not looking at her, Peter got out and picked up his sword from the back seat. He fixed it onto his belt and walked across the small yard towards the entrance of Drumfork Naval Club, a low-slung 1960s building. It was used as a social space for naval families, and as everything in Helensburgh was run down and grey-looking. Peter noticed the ice on the ground too late and slipped on the steps. "You okay?" he heard Kaisa say behind him, but he didn't have the energy to reply to her. Instead, he cursed under his breath and took a handkerchief out of his pocket to wipe the palm of his hand. There were a few spots of blood. "Fuck," he said out loud. Glancing down, he saw his uniform trousers had escaped the worst of it and still looked crisp and smart. They still had the deep creases he'd ironed into them that morning. Inside it was even colder than on the windswept hill. Peter rubbed his hands together, keeping a hanky between them in an attempt to stem the blood, which was dribbling out of the fleshier part of his right palm. He nodded to the same wren who'd shown him into Himmler's office 3 weeks before. She didn't smile as she stood up from the grey plastic chair she'd been sitting on, but her eyes had a kindness to them. Peter moved his face away from hers. During the past few weeks, he'd heard nothing but condolences. People saying how sorry they were. He didn't need their sympathy. He needed this to be over and to get back to work. Even Kaisa had nothing but sorrow in her eyes, and Peter couldn't stand it. What he needed was anger. He needed people to understand how angry he was. Angry at Kaisa, angry at Duncan, angry at the Navy for posting him and his new young pretty wife to this God-forsaken asshole of a place. Angry at Scotland and the bloody jocks complaining in their harsh accents. Angry at the drab, ugly married quarters on the hillside, overlooking the steely, cold Gairloch. Angry at himself for being so stupid as to care that his wife had slept with someone else. He put his handkerchief back into his pocket and told himself to calm down. The door behind him opened and his lawyer, who had been to see Peter at home, shook his and Kaisa's hand. Peter flinched. The stone steps had grazed his palm, and even though the bleeding had stopped, it still hurt. "You okay?" The guy, who was probably only a few years older than Peter, asked. Peter looked at his hand. "Sure." The lawyer nodded and turned to Kaisa. "Perhaps, Mrs. Williams, you'd like to go in. Sit at the front. They need to see you two together." Kaisa nodded and went inside. When they met previously, the lawyer had also immediately said how sorry he was about the incident, as he called it. Lawrence Curry was a lieutenant like Peter, but he'd studied law in Edinburgh and had a slight Scottish lilt when he spoke. The accent had put Peter off him at first, but he warmed to the man when he told Peter that the court-martial would run its course whatever you or I may think. He'd said that the panel would have decided what the outcome would be even before Peter stepped inside the room. So the best thing is to stand there, reply to any questions as quickly and briefly as possible and get out. Then you can get on with the rest of your life. Yes and no responses are the best, he'd added. Now Lieutenant Curry motioned for Peter to go and sit at the far end of the room, out of the earshot, off the wren, Peter supposed. "We've got a little time to go over everything," the lawyer started. He told Peter that he should plead guilty to assault. "I will then bring in the mitigating circumstances of you being back from your first patrol, the wee shite whom you'd considered to be a friend, taking advantage of your pretty foreign wife and so on." Peter nodded. He wasn't looking at the lawyer, but was hanging his head. He was trying not to let the anger rise again. "Are you okay?" the lawyer asked again, touching Peter's arm. Peter looked up. "I'm not pleading guilty." The lawyer was silent for a moment, then sighed and said, "I strongly advise you to show yourself at the mercy of the court. They will have sympathy for you." Peter moved his eyes away from Lawrence. The lawyer sighed again. "Now, don't forget they will take your sword from you. It means that as an officer you are placing your rank, status and reputation on hold for the duration of the proceedings." Peter nodded. "When are we going in?" "Any minute now, but there's something else I need to tell you. There will be reporters outside with cameras. One of them is from the local rag, Helena Advertiser. But there's also the Nationals, Daily Mail, The Sun and The Telegraph." Peter put his head in his hands. He thought about his parents, his brother in London and his sister. They'd all read about his stupid actions, and they would have to explain it to their friends. Until now he'd been something of a local hero in Wiltshire. His achievements in cricket during his school years had often been written about in the Wiltshire Times. and when he passed out from Dartmouth, there had been a long article about it in the same local paper. That was partly because Prince Andrew had graduated at the same time, so the Queen had also been there. Still, it was a picture of Peter in the freshly pressed naval officer's uniform that had appeared inside the paper. Even when he'd married Kaisa, his mother had sent in a wedding picture to the paper, which had printed it with the caption, "Local submarine officer RN marries a girl from Finland." Now they would have something far juicier to write about. Would they dig out the picture of him and Kaisa on their wedding day? Suddenly a phrase he'd often heard came into his mind. There's a touch of the pirate about every man who wears the dolphins. He grinned and recalled when he had caught the dolphins, the badge of the submarine service, between his teeth from a glass of rum. It was an old Royal Navy rite of passage on qualification and proved that submariners were a bit wild. He immediately regretted such thoughts and straightened his face. Then the door opened and he was loudly called in by the naval provost. Thank you. Thank you.